Hello, everybody. This is NGO Soul+Strategy, and this is Tosca. And today I am very happy to ask somebody who I greatly respect questions that have to do with when nonprofits and social movements use advocacy and campaigning methods. My question often is, when is it best to use more radical, and I'm using air quotes here, activist approaches such as civic disobedience actions, mass public mobilization that can draw a lot of passionate participants, but at the same time can also draw a relatively narrow slice of the population, versus when is it best to focus on gaining a broad public support as a social movement or NGO, even if that requires the social movement to change or moderate its demands, change its messages and its methods. That is the topic of this episode, and we're going to apply it to the topic of climate change activism. So, a little introduction. As you all know, we've seen a wave of youth-led climate change activist networks that have chosen sometimes to engage in more radical forms of civic agitation, activism, and nonviolent civil disobedience. Examples, of course, are Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement here in the US, and also the Pan-African Climate Change Alliance, and many others. Some, such as Extinction Rebellion, are comfortable with very high-profile, large-scale disruption of daily life. Some of its members are comfortable with causing property damage, and the movement tends to use mass arrest and imprisonment sometimes as tactics. Now, some critics would consider that environmental fanatics, and I'm again air quoting this, who risk alienating potential supporters. In this interview, I am interviewing Aseem Prakash, academic and public thought leader on climate change activism as undertaken by nonprofits, but also social movement, and his partner, Nives Dolčak. Today, I'm interviewing Aseem. And in a complementary episode, I'm going to also interview a young Extinction Rebellion activist about the same question about strategies, tactics, and trade-offs. But now let's turn to Aseem. Welcome, Aseem. It's good to have you back on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's such an interesting topic. I'm looking forward to this. So a little bio on Aseem. Aseem is the Walker Family Professor and the founding director of the Center for Environmental Politics, very significant here, at the University of Washington in Washington State in the US. He has several research interests besides environmental policy and activism. One of them is NGOs, their governance, and their accountability. And Aseem, before joining the University of Washington, was an assistant professor in strategic management and public policy at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., also here in the US. He also worked in the private sector at Procter & Gamble Corporation in India. And Nives Dolčak, his partner and research partner, is professor in sustainability science and director of the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs at the University of Washington in Seattle as well. And she also was a visiting professor at a university in Slovenia. Okay, Aseem, so first, can you position first this your interest and Nives's interest in climate change activism, as well as policy around climate change? How is that embedded in your overall research agenda?
So both Nives and I are very interested in climate issues. And separately, we are also very interested in civil society. We are students of Eleanor Ostrom, who's done some pioneering work on civil society, local community-led initiatives towards governance. So climate activism, climate social movements are a natural confluence of the two research interests we have.
I see. So this is a bit of an abrupt pivot, but it's something that in my own work, sometimes I have been interested in. As you know, environmental activism in general, not just climate change activism, has de facto was historically dominated by white upper middle class liberals and thus suffered from what some would call an aura of white elitism. That the environment, in other words, is mainly something that citizens care about when most of their other material needs are met, is my impression. And is that criticism indeed justified? And to what extent, Aseem, is that changing now?
So I think it's a complex question. You are right that historically, at least the conservation movement has been led by the white upper class. So it's the conservation of the elite, because they want to protect pristine forests for future generations. But you start thinking about future generations if your tummies are full. And oftentimes conservation meant evicting indigenous and native people from their lands.
Yeah.
So there was little attention to paid on who's picking up the cost, the tab of conserving natural resources. But in recent years, I think conservation movement has become a bit more widespread, though again, in developing countries, indigenous people, women who are directly affected when the forests are logged, when water scarcity becomes very severe, when they have to walk longer and longer to collect firewood to cook food. So they have become kind of active in protecting local resources, because this is what we call the environmentalism of the poor.
I see.
Because these people, there's an excellent book that I would recommend to everybody. It's a book on the author is Martinez Allier. It's called The Environmentalism of the Poor, published in 2003.
Okay, we'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah. So in some instances, people are directly affected by environmental destruction.
Yeah.
And when it comes to conservation, so poor people rise up. The same thing we can see in the US. The whole environmental justice movement is essentially a movement of the disadvantaged communities. When toxic sites, dumping sites are located in the neighborhood, and they're suffering disproportionate impact of pollution. So there are different strands of the climate movement. There is certainly a perception that the climate movement is urban, metropolitan, white, and they're less concerned about certain aspects of who picks up the cost of climate policy. But there are different strands of climate movement as well that are talking about justice issues.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Let me jump ahead to a question that I was going to ask you about that. Is it challenging in some ways for social movements or formally registered nonprofits or NGOs to hold up environmental conservation and protection, and as well as mitigation when it comes to climate change, obviously, and environmental justice and equity at the same time? Or are these things easily integratable, if you will, de facto on a day-to-day basis by movements?
So this is a question that is being debated. So one thing's for sure, that if you want to protect the environment, it should be for everybody. Mm-hmm. It should not be protecting environment for some and not for others. So in that case, if we really want to serve humanity, justice is an intrinsic part of protecting the nature. Justice is inherent in reducing pollution. I think the challenge arises on instruments and how we do it and what do we prioritize. Okay. So for example, we want to reduce emissions, but we enact a carbon tax. And we know that poor people spend a larger proportions of their income on energy. So unless until poor people are compensated in some way, they find that environmental books are being kind of balanced on their back. That's why in the state of Washington, on 2 occasions, 2016 and 2018, we voted down a carbon tax referendum.
Interesting.
So I don't think the quarrel is about the goals. The quarrel is about the instruments and what kind of policy instruments. Or think about rooftop solar, the huge debate on net metering that happened in California.
Yeah.
People who don't own houses say that, why are house owners being subsidized to have rooftop solar? We can't even afford it. The same debate is happening on electric vehicles, that only the rich can afford electric vehicles. So if you start giving subsidies, is it really coming to the poor? So it's not a question about environmental goals. It's a question of policy instruments.
Got it. That's a clear answer. Yes. And in a recent topic, I'm in a recent blog post that you wrote, news and you wrote about the topic of renewable energy and about the need for climate activists to listen more to rural communities, not just here in the US, but elsewhere as well, and rural citizens, and their felt need to resist renewable energy projects. You mentioned that this resistance happens in the UK, Germany, Spain, South Korea, as well as the US. What are the issues there exactly?
So 24% of US counties, 24, that means almost 1 in 4, have enacted ordinances restricting renewable energy facilities. Wow. Yeah, that's pretty big. In fact, some would argue that the real challenge in climate politics is not, passing new laws. It is creating renewable energy facilities and putting transmission lines to move that electricity from production centers to consumption centers. There are 2-3 issues involved. The first issue is that people in rural areas believe that the rural aesthetics, the sense of ruralness that they cherish, is getting destroyed. So, for example, in Germany, these are called asparagus. The wind turbines are called asparagus. I don't know the German term because, they're kind of jutting out.
Right.
And the second issue is that electricity is being generated in rural areas, but for consumption in urban areas. So once again, rural areas are kind of subsidizing urban areas.
Got it.
And anybody who kind of, opposes the climate project, sometimes some climate groups, not all, are very quick to dub them as climate skeptics or climate deniers. Not understanding that people are not questioning climate science. People are questioning who bears the cost of energy transition.
Very interesting.
So it's a distributional issue. It's not a scientific issue.
So it's distributional, it's partially about rural urban, and it's also about class. And myself living in a rural part of the US, and coming myself from a rural background, and knowing how that your first point that you mentioned about identity, it's incredibly important, that place-based identity and pride, and not to want that, people not wanting to have that tempered with. I resonate with it. I'm glad I asked you that.
Well, Dutch farmers have been protesting against a lot of European Union rules on fertilizers. Because again, it's a sense of that we've been doing this. Who are these people in Brussels to tell us how to grow food?
Exactly. And it's led in the Netherlands, my home country, to a significant political upheaval, as you know, probably better than I do. So talking still about some of these trade-offs, right? So Greta Thunberg, the well-known Scandinavian climate change activist, posed, I think, a reality check when she decided recently to side with indigenous people groups who push back against wind farms, for instance. And so ignoring the pushback from historically marginalized communities towards what are in other areas accepted forms of renewable energy, that raises for me the question about the importance attached to equity and justice in decarbonation. Can you comment a little bit, give us a little bit more context for that?
Yeah. So climate justice, if you step back or think broadly, it's talked in 3 different ways. The first is poor and the marginal are going to suffer disproportionately from extreme weather events. That's a very typical notion of climate justice.
Yeah.
But there are 2 other notions. One is whenever we enact a climate policy, there are certain costs. Who picks up these costs?
Yeah.
So in Greta's instance, it is really the Samis who believe that they are picking up the cost because the wind turbines are in their cultural lands, in their ancestral lands. The same debates are happening in other places as well. And the third notion is who gets the climate benefits. If you subsidize electric vehicles, if you subsidize solar panels, who actually is picking up or who's actually coordinating the benefits? So the asymmetrical, the uneven distribution of benefits and costs are equally important dimensions in climate change. So in case of Greta and the windmills or the wind farms, it is really that the cost of renewable energy transition is being offloaded on historically vulnerable communities. And that's why climate change, at least in some instances, has an element of inequity that we need to be very cognizant of. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And I'm, again, linking that also to broad political what shall I call it? Directions or trends, because in some of at least the global north countries that I'm familiar with, there is a direct correlation between populism, right, and the support for it, not only in rural areas, but certainly amongst others in rural area, coming out of a sense of being forgotten, being ignored, and getting more and more behind. Is that fair?
Yeah. So whether it's France, the Yellow Vest protests, whether in other places, they think it's this big government, the technical elite, the scientific elite, that's
Yes.
kind of imposing its preferences on all of us.
Yes.
And they don't want to hear from all of us. And if we oppose, they're said we are uneducated, we are, climate deniers, or we are what is called the basket of deplorables, the term Hillary Clinton used to describe some portion of the white working class in 2016.
Right.
So climate change is embedded in a cultural war. And populism means, you're questioning the establishment, you're distrustful of the establishment. And unless until we have climate change for the people, as opposed to climate change as mandated by IPCC or Brussels, we are going to have a pushback.
I see. And so do you see social movements such as Extinction Rebellion or the Sunrise Movement, or environmental NGOs, your big brand names, right? We all know them. Do you see them get caught up in this climate change, populism, class, rural, urban? Do they sometimes trip over themselves, or do they generally navigate that fairly competently?
So all these movements you have mentioned, these are urban elite movements led by educated people. Is
that generally that we know that from the data?
Yeah, I think so. Because if you look at so for example, let me give you a very concrete example. In last year, 2022, there were 38 instances of what we call museum vandalism. People throwing tomato soup on Mona Lisa or this and that. 38.
How many did you say?
38. We
38,
actually have
much more than I was aware. And just maybe, Aseem, for those who haven't picked up on those news, can you give an example or two of what you call museum vandalism?
Museum vandalism refers to those instances where activists go to a museum and try to deface superficially an important piece of art. Of course, all these pieces of art have a glass covering. So the piece of art itself is not damaged, but they'll throw tomato soup, or they'll do something, or glue themselves to all these paintings. Yes. And when they're doing it, they're live streaming it. So the idea is to get the maximum impact in terms of a shocking incident. So this
it's a symbolic act and a media oriented act, right? Both social media and mainstream media.
Right. It's social media and mainstream media. And, museums are very sacred places. You go there, you're quiet, you're respectful, you're watching something that has survived for centuries. And, museums are owned by humanity, not by a particular country. So when people come and vandalize it, there's obviously a very shocking incident. It's a sacrilege, it's cultural sacrilege. And yet these climate activists, that's exactly what they want. They believe that we are destroying the earth. Earth is like a museum. Earth has these precious species that we are destroying by our reckless emissions of carbon dioxide. So there's a narrative, there's a counter narrative. So 38 of these incidents were reported last year. And almost all, except for a couple, were in Europe. And 60% of these were only in 3 countries, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom. So a lot of these radical tactics are very, very European, or very, very white, very, very white, related to global north. Because in developing countries, there are barely any museums. And for their cultural pursuits, people don't go to museums. They'll go to community events. They'll have religious festivals and so on and so forth. So the way people pursue their cultural needs differs across societies. Global South is not a museum-centered society. So clearly, this museum tactic is completely irrelevant for the Global South.
Irrelevant, yes.
So,
yes.
So it's interesting to see that some of the actions, some of the tactics, etc., that some of these groups are undertaking, they are very, very north focused, and there's nothing wrong in it. Groups have their own competencies, but we have to realize that they don't speak for the world. They
Yeah.
speak for very specific constituencies that they represent.
Right. And why don't you tell us a little bit more about the pretty strong debates that those museum vandalism acts that they caused, right? People for and people against. Can you posit that a little bit for our audience?
Sure. So the debate is not only museum vandalism, but other what we call disruptive events.
Disruptive.
Think of Extinction Rebellion in United Kingdom, somebody you will interview in your next show. So they'll stop traffic, or they'll block highways, causing disruption, causing inconvenience. But that's precisely what they want. That people should kind of get out of their lethargy and stupor and say, oh my God, this is something very serious.
Yeah.
So all these incidents are happening, and there is a debate whether it's good or bad in promoting environmental cause. The people who are for it say that every movement should have good cops and bad cops. So this is what we call the radical flank effect. That if you have a radical section of a social movement, then the mainstream movement seems more reasonable. And the authorities and the people who hold the levers of power are more likely to agree to the demands put by mainstream movements, because the radical...
In other words, the mainstream authorities and decision makers will be more willing to negotiate with the quote more moderate flank, because they said, at least if we do that, their demands are more moderate. If we negotiate with them, we don't have to deal with these radical folks.
Correct. So in some ways, it's a good cop, bad cop. The radical flank is the bad cop, and so the good cop becomes more reasonable. The counter is that by these disruptive events, the radical flank is antagonizing people. Because if you step back and say, what is the purpose of these radical actions? And the answer is the radical actions are meant to increase public awareness.
Right.
But then the response is public already knows about climate change. It's, media and other things are saturated with climate news. So is the obstruction in climate progress lack of awareness, or is the politics more complex?
I'm just hesitating for a moment when you said people already know about climate change. I know that is largely the case, but as you know, I live in a country, you live in a country where climate change denial, or at least skepticism, is still fairly broad. So not just the justice side, but just the very fact. So
actually, that's not true.
No,
climate denialism in America has fallen dramatically.
Is it? Tell me more.
You look at Pew polls. Vast majority of people want governmental action on climate change. It's not that people don't want it. The debate, the concern is about the policy instruments. So if you look at the US Senate, there are very few climate deniers left. Everybody agrees climate change is happening. The issue is, how should we go about? So for example, Republicans would prefer carbon capture. They would not, they don't want, punitive taxation on fossil fuel industry, et cetera, et cetera. And even the climate deniers know about climate change. And I don't think if you throw tomato soup at Mona Lisa, the climate deniers say, oh my God, why am I denying climate change? This is something very serious. No, so this is what you call, people look for things that validate their prior beliefs. So I don't think climate change is a low salience issue. It's a pretty high salience issue. People have already made up their mind.
Okay, I'm glad you set me right on that one. So you say it's really more, again, about the instruments.
It's instruments, and there are some studies, not lots, that suggest that people overall disapprove of museum vandalism. People disapprove when their everyday lives are disrupted, when somebody blocks the highway, somebody disrupts the train. And sometimes, at least in England, the issues have become a bit physical, where local people who are, moms or dads who are rushing to home to pick up their kids, and suddenly their trains or subways are blocked. They are not happy. So they have tried to physically lift the protesters out off the tracks, sometimes off the roads, because their daily lives are getting disrupted. They don't have the luxury for disruption.
And before we started recording, Aseem, you told me that Nevis and you are publishing an article shortly that will be open access. So we will have it linked in the show notes about museum vandalism around climate change. Can you tell me briefly what is the main argument in the article?
Sure. So the title of the article is Climate Action by Vandalizing Museums, When, Where, Who. So we are creating a data set that can answer 3 questions. When did this happen? in which countries did it happen, and who did this.
Hmm.
When this has happened, this is essentially a tactic that sprang up between May and December of 2022.
Hmm.
In 2023, there have been only 3 instances, whereas in 2022, there were 38 instances.
So it was a peak, but it may not.
Peaking around COP meeting in Egypt.
Right.
So it was very strategically timed,
Right.
where essentially it's taking place in Europe, and even within Europe in 3 countries, England, Germany, and Italy.
Like you
That's where
said.
all these things are taken. And who is doing it? There are, of course, a range of organizations, but there are 3 organizations that are responsible for these: Just Stop Oil UK, Ultima Generazione Italy, and let's say Generation Germany. And all 3 organizations are part of something called 822 network. So it's not very clear whether they're formally coordinating their actions, but it seems there is some kind of an informal, at least, consultation going on. What is the model of the story? This is a tactic which is very time specific, which is very region specific, and which is very actor specific. Mainstream organizations like Greenpeace, who routinely undertake disruptive action, are not participating in museum vandalism.
But they are participating in, for instance, blocking highways, like in my home country, the Netherlands. At least they are collaborating with Extinction Rebellion, right?
Right. So Greenpeace, I think it really varies, but you're right. Sometimes they are participating in, say, highway or picketing oil terminals. But when it comes to museum vandalism, they have not participated in it.
Right.
So it's a very interesting that they have the competency. They have been doing, climbing on top of the buildings, unfurling banners, boarding ships that are, going to nuclear sites, etc., etc. So this is what the paper is trying to do. It's going to create a data set. It will put it in public access. People can see it.
Great.
And let there be debate and let there be research.
And that's exactly why I wanted to interview you today. Can we say, Aseem, that these different choices of instruments for activism, let's say, can we broadly map them onto the kind of insider and outsider strategies in activism, or is it a little different?
I think that's a good way to think about it. So it's not going through the insider, the regular policy process of lobbying, of petitioning, of writing comments, participating in town hall meetings. Here, the tactics are more radical. So, when people say radical groups, radical can mean 2 things. One, radical is in terms of aims, abolish capitalism. That's radical. So none of these groups are saying abolish capitalism. So their goals are not radical, but their tactics are radical or outside tactics because they are disruptive. They're trying to disrupt. They're non-violent, but they're disruptive.
Right. Yes. Now, since we talked about insider and outsider strategy, and I have to be cognizant of the time. As you know, social movements such as Extinction Rebellion and Sunrise and others in the realm of climate change, collaborating with formally registered NGOs and nonprofits is not always either occurring that much or that effective. How 2 very different types of civil society entities, if you will, agents, how can they best collaborate and complement each other? Where have you seen good examples, and what kind of approaches were used to express that complementarity and to not, especially for the NGOs, to not flatten what is the strength of the movement, and at the same time for the social movement to allow the NGOs to complement it and to amplify them? How have you seen these dynamics?
So I belong to the school of thought that says, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Because if people want to express their political preferences in a non-violent way, in a civil way, people should be free to do so. When they do it individually, an individual person standing outside an oil terminal and saying, stop fossil fuels, or individual part of a local community spontaneously organized, or an individual part of, say, Greenpeace. So these are individual choices. And in a well-functioning democracy, people should have the right to express their choices in a legal, non-violent way. So prima facie, I don't see any tension. I actually see, as I said, the radical flank effect working an advantage. That when you have these spontaneous local protests against specific policies, Dakota Access Pipeline, that saw massive mobilization, it was both formally registered organizations and spontaneously evolving organizations. People converged there, they felt very strongly about the issue, and they wanted to their voices to be heard. Even if, the project went through, still, people took a stand and said, this is wrong. If you want an oil pipeline, why did you route it through a water body that can threaten the water supply of a native nation? So I like the fact that we have heterogeneity. I like the fact that there is no one size fit all.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that there is democracy and, people can express their political preferences in the ways they deem fit.
Sure. I am totally with you on that, of course. My question, what I'm curious about is NGOs in particular, which is more my field of knowledge, have not always either, what should I say, sought to proactively collaborate social movements in a way where each of the respective strengths of both actors, if you will, was respected as well utilized, so that they truly, as I said, were complementary. Sometimes when I see them collaborate at all, and I think it's underutilized, is I see that the social movement becomes fairly quickly worried about that its identity and the vigor of its civic activism gets flattened by the NGO. And there are in academia critiques on that as well, as you know. So I'm curious about your comments on it in this space of environmental sector.
So it's a broader debate. So there is a big concern that our political parties in decline, because you have all these spontaneous groups that are popping up, making political demands. And what are the pros and cons of maintaining a rigid political party system? And, people can argue both sides, et cetera, et cetera. I would say the same debate is happening in our sector as well. That should we work with established NGO sectors, NGO organizations, or should we have space for spontaneously issue-specific, area-specific mobilization? They pop up, then they disappear, et cetera, et cetera. So do they undermine the traditional mainstream NGOs? And as I said, I am of the school of thought of let 100 flowers bloom.
Let's have as many as possible, as citizens want to.
If citizens want to, and the onus is on the mainstream NGOs to demonstrate their effectiveness and usefulness to citizens. I don't like policy monopolies that, if you want to agitate, you have to come to us. I don't like that idea. I don't like that model. So it's probably, I think it's a wake-up call for mainstream organizations.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
There is at least a section of population that wants specific kinds of advocacy.
Yeah.
And they're not providing it. So, there's a demand, but there's no supply. So obviously, a spontaneous group is emerging to supply those kinds of environmental advocacy products.
Got it. Yeah. You mentioned the peaking of museum vandalism, right, in the 3 European countries within 1 year. Do you want to comment on the sustainability of quote unquote radical activism in terms of tactics, I should say now? Again, you specified that before. The sustainability of such civic activism. Do we know of examples where that was actually sustained over multiple years versus these peak moments?
So Extinction Rebellion has actually discontinued radical action. They are no longer picketing, they're no longer blocking highways.
Is it a pause or is it a stop?
I don't know. At the moment, it's a pause, but it's a pretty long pause. And for organizations that are constantly feeding on publicity, it is a long pause. However, other groups are still continuing. But as I said, in 2023, there have been only 3 instances, 2 in the US, 1 in Italy. Actually, 1 in US, 1 in Sweden, 1 in Italy. Trevi Fountain, Monet, and Degas. Will this continue? Will it stage a comeback? I don't know, but my guess is that a lot of the groups are thinking of new and radical ways to garner public attention. If this tactic has become stale or it's not working, they're probably learning from it. And that's what we are seeing in 2023. But it's possible in some of the contexts, it may stage a comeback. We don't know.
Right.
I think the moral of the story is it's a very dynamic field.
Very.
And there are lots of organizations that are trying to find a foothold, that are trying to get media attention, that are trying to become, the leading, the vanguard of the climate movement.
Right.
And they will undertake policies to garner public attention, the way Greenpeace has done in the past, undertaken policies to garner public attention.
Yes, yes. And it's good to know that you and Nives are going to continue to track this field and are going to continue to blog, not just write academic articles, but also blog about it, which I think is so useful. The kind of role that you and Nives play in terms of not just staying in academia, but actually writing shorter articles for a much broader audience. It's very welcome, I feel. So with that, with having said that, so where should people go if they want to find out more about you and Nives's both academic research that is open access and your blogging activity?
I think the best place is to Google us, Aseem Prakash, University of Washington, and you'll come to my website, and all my material and all Nives's web material are on the website.
Okay.
Whether it's articles, whether it's the commentaries, everything is on the website.
Everything is on the website. Okay. And you publish in Forbes, I see from
we are a contributor, contractual contributor in Forbes.
Yes, which gets you to a much bigger audience. So I really encourage our listeners to do exactly what Aseem just said and Google both him and Nives, and you will find some pretty interesting and very timely commentary on what happens in the more broadly the environmental, not just climate change, but environmental policy sphere, but also the activism sphere and the role of citizens in that. So with that, Aseem, thank you so much for coming back on the show to talk about your insights in this really important field. And thank you, listeners. If you found this podcast episode stimulating, then be sure to check out the fact that I have a couple more episodes on campaigning strategies and tactics, instruments, as Aseem just said, not just goals, such as episode number 18 with Paul O'Brien, formerly senior leader at Oxfam America, and currently the CEO of Amnesty US. And to hear more about Aseem's point of view, I have interviewed him before on the podcast, as I referenced, about ethics and integrity issues in the nonprofit sphere and why the assumption that nonprofits are virtuous has its troubling side effects. And that is episode 37. And we will link to those episodes in the show notes. And you can find those, dear listeners, not just on my website, 5oaksconsulting.org with the number 5, but also on my YouTube channel. Subscribe to my email list and you'll always be the first to be in the know. And with that, this is Tosca, and I look forward to spending time with you on NGO Soul and Strategy next time.
Thank you.